Just as building architecture helps us to understand a new building before it is built, so enterprise architecture helps us to understand a new enterprise before it is built. The Federation of Enterprise Architecture Professional Organizations has this to say about enterprise architecture. By the end of this video, you should understand this completely. Central to every business are its processes. Process 1 leads to process 2, leads to process 3. Those processes normally have names that make sense to the people who are running the business, and within each of those processes, there are further sub-processes. Business processes are the responsibility of a department or a group. And as we go deeper into the sub-processes, eventually we get to procedures. Procedures are the responsibility of an individual or a team. Procedures themselves may use additional resources within the company. They may be run by a specific role, aimed at specific customer, produce specific documentation or use it, and so on. And because those resources are used within the procedure, we get to understand that they are part of that process. Because we know the cost of the people involved in performing a process and the resources that are used, we can understand its costs and its profitability. Some activities are essential to the operation of a procedure and need to be measured. Here we've marked an activity with a key performance indicator. A key performance indicator is simply a report that goes to management so that they can understand the performance of a specific activity and therefore the performance of a specific process. And we would also mark the process as having key performance indicators within it. As part of the strategic development of the enterprise, senior stakeholders may identify a new capability they wish to develop. And they may understand that within that capability, they're going to create a website that is aimed at a specific set of customers who will have items delivered to them, and they understand who will actually run that new capability. As part of that capability, we will define a set of processes called a value stream. These are the processes that are essential to the operation of the new capability. In order to align the new capability with our existing business process architecture, we might identify which processes that are already existing need to change, and if any need to be removed, and whether any new processes need to be added. Within each of those processes, we would identify what procedures need to be created, what resources those procedures would use, and which activities needed to be monitored so that we can ensure the successful development of the strategy, which would then lead us to understand how much it will cost to develop this new strategy. As several of the activities have KPIs attached to them, they allow us to provide empirical proof that our strategy is successful and it is leading towards a strategic objective. Although our stakeholders consider the objective to be strategic, it may be just one of several business objectives. These objectives may themselves be part of a larger objective for the enterprise. Every enterprise in every country must follow the local laws, and legislation can be broken down into sections, subsections, clauses, and subclauses. If a specific process has legislative requirements that must be followed, we would show that next to the process. And within specific procedures, we may show that specific activities are subject to the law, and perhaps even that there are specific roles created by the law. In highly regulated industries, a process may not only have a legislative requirement, but it may have a KPI to prove its compliance with that requirement. Risks are events that the enterprise would like to avoid. When an activity has a risk associated with it, we would show that on its diagram, and we would also show it at the process level so that management can understand that there is a risk event associated with that process. To help the enterprise avoid risk events, we would normally create a specific set of procedures called controls designed to prevent the risk, and if the risk event does happen, another set of controls that are designed for the enterprise to recover from that risk event. At the process level, we would show that there is a risk event associated with the process but that we also have controls in place to manage that risk. So far, we've only talked about the business architecture, but a modern enterprise is significantly digital. That means that each process is supported by data and also may require information in order to operate correctly. It's also important to understand that the messages that are transferred from process to process, while they may be digital, could also be manual. This allows us to understand when we look at our process architecture that while it is supported by data, we can also help IT to understand that sometimes the data is transferred manually. Many of the activities in procedures will use applications. When a user has entered data into an application, that data is often passed to other applications to help other parts of the enterprise. So we can see that this is almost analogous, that the data that's passed from process to process is very similar to the data that's passed from application to application, and sometimes they are indeed the same. Underlying our applications is the technical architecture formed by things like our servers. For an enterprise application, we may have multiple servers running significant applications that are supported by several databases. And we will also know the location of our data because we understand which servers are hosting which databases. So because we understand which data and which applications are used in specific procedures, because we understand where those procedures are in our process architecture, we get to understand which applications support which processes. Which means that we understand that the business processes are supported by data, that the business processes are supported by applications, and that the business is supported by the infrastructure underlying both the data and the applications. All of this allows us to understand that everything within the enterprise is linked. So from our process, we understand what procedures it contains, who runs them, what resources those procedures use, and many indirect links from that process down through the enterprise and into the IT. This allows us to provide views of the architecture tailored to specific stakeholders. For instance, we get to understand which of our processes are of strategic importance, which will be of interest to executives. If the risk management team wants to know about data, we understand where information is kept about risks within the enterprise, and indeed whether there are any specific databases that might themselves be subject to risk events. We can also understand which of our procedures are there to control those risks. Because we understand the links between all of these what are called artifacts within the business architecture, the data architecture, the application architecture, and the technology, we can divine many implications from those artifacts and links. For the data architecture team, we can give a complete view of the enterprise, and because we understand that the processes have both automatic and manual transport of data between them through messages, it's quite possible that we may discover that the implicit links between our databases mean that we can rearrange all of our data so that way we can have a more efficient understanding of our data and use it to a better effect. All of these things add up to allow us to understand the implications of change within an enterprise. So for instance, if a specific procedure has a legislative requirement and that procedure uses a specific set of applications that run on a specific set of servers, it may well be that one of those servers is subject to legislation. When an innovation is discovered that might cause a significant change to the enterprise, such as a new type of application or a new type of resource, we can very quickly discover where within the enterprise the change needs to happen. We can then put in place KPIs to ensure that we get a good return on investment and understand both the costs and profitability of the innovation. A business architect works with business people to define the business architecture. That includes processes and procedures, the messages that travel between them, any legislative requirements. The business architect will also help to develop the strategic objectives and to understand any risks that need to be managed and the controls that need to be put in place to manage them. As the business architecture is developed, a data architect will work with the business architects to define the data that is used. That includes messages that go between the processes and procedures, any data that is used during the course of a process, and any information that is needed in order for the process to succeed. The data architect will use that work to move on to define any databases and the data structure to support both the data and information needs of the business architecture. A solution architect will then work with the business architects and data architects to understand their needs so that appropriate applications can be acquired. It may be that at this point, the work is handed off to an application architect if custom development is needed. When the data and application architectures are suitably well defined, the solution architect or application architect will work with an infrastructure architect in order to define the underlying technology, the servers, the networks, and devices that will be used to support the data and applications. Lastly, there is the enterprise architect, who is responsible for the work of all of the other architects, the business architecture, the data architecture, the applications, and the technology that support them, and is also responsible for ensuring that all of those architectures meet the strategic goals of the enterprise. And so we come back to the Federation of Enterprise Architecture Professional Organizations description of enterprise architecture. EA is a well-defined practice for conducting enterprise analysis. Analysis because we are able to look at all of the enterprise. Enterprise design because we are able to design all of the enterprise. Planning because our designs can be passed through to project and program management in order to change the enterprise. And implementation because we can use our plans and designs to ensure that the implementation matches what the senior stakeholders expected. Using a comprehensive approach at all times because we understand all aspects of the enterprise for the successful development and execution of strategy. So because we understand how to develop a strategy from its initial concept through to a detailed design, we are able to execute it successfully and in a measured way. This is not the first version of this video, and it probably won't be the last. If you have ideas for its improvement, please leave a comment below.